we are privileged to have Dr. Steve Froehlich lead our session this morning as well as at the lunch hour. Steve is a pastor first and foremost. You'll see that in all of his conversations. He's pastored New Life Church in Ithaca, New York for the last 20 years. Ithaca is, as he reminds me, the San Francisco of upstate New York. Living in the shadow of these two great universities, Cornell and Ithaca. As we know, the conversations around the universities are normally 5 or 10 years ahead of where the rest of the culture is. So Steve has really been on the front lines in many ways. He is on the board and a significant presence at the Chesterton House, a significant center for Christian studies on the campus of Cornell, and has been quite instrumental in the direction for that center. He has also been quite active in the community. You'll see that in many of the anecdotes he raises in and around Ithaca. He has been trained, we'll forgive him for this, at Reformed Theological Seminary with his MDiv, but by God's grace, he finished and completed his Doctor of Ministry with us here at Gordon-Conwell. So all is well that ends well, as they say. Steve was actually a theater major as an undergrad and has a deep love for the relationship between theology and the arts, and in many ways an outgrowth of his concern for the breadth of interests represented in a congregation is very much a part of his background. He's married to Cheryl, who graciously has joined him to give him encouragement in this couple of days with us here at Gordon-Conwell. 3 sons and 4 grandchildren. So we welcome to our podium this afternoon for lunch discussion and conversation on the questions of gender dysphoria and pastoral care. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you, President Hollinger. Thank you for Suzanne and for all you've done to make this a very hospitable and welcome event. I want to thank Cheryl, too, for her help in helping me organize my thoughts. She's really a great asset in all that I do, and her skill and wisdom is reflected in anything that's good about the material today. I mentioned this morning, but want to say again that I really am speaking to you as a pastor. I'm not a clinician. I'm not the scholar in this area. I'm simply a fellow traveler, and believe that the Lord has set before us an opportunity to serve and care for some folks in our congregation. And the last 2 years has been a journey of trying to figure out how to do that well. And I do not claim to do this perfectly. I'm sure that many of you here have things to teach me, and I would be glad to learn from you. But I hope that what I offer you today is the fruit of real honest reflection and conversation, reading, and anguish and prayerful reflection that I pray is helpful to you, for those of you that are involved in care for friends who live with gender dysphoria. Our 3 sessions today are organized sort of this way. We looked at background assumptions and definitions this morning. I'll review that very lightly for you again. This session is going to look at some of the biblical texts that come into view when we talk about the topic of gender dysphoria. And then the third session is going to be on so what do we say, what do we do, both in conversation with our friends who are struggling and as congregations. Again, for those of you that were here this morning, this will be a slight bit of review, so bear with me, please. When we talk about pastoral care and gender dysphoria, we begin with a person, not the movement. The transgender movement is enormously diverse, and the people who would identify as transgender do so for a host of reasons. Some people are involved because of sexual experimentation or any number of things, but we are very narrowly looking at those folks who live with this condition that we identify as gender dysphoria, and that we identify them as living with it in a persistent way. It is a part of their life experience, genuinely a part of their life experience. And as Mark Yarhouse has said, remember, when you meet one person with gender dysphoria, you've met one person with gender dysphoria. A single person does not define the whole movement. And so as we learn how to love well those who are in our life, we want to remember that we are speaking to them as individuals. We are loving them where they are, in the circumstances of their life, where they are, the history of their lives that they bring into that moment. And a single person does not define the whole movement. One of the things that we've found in caring for a young person in our congregation who lives with gender dysphoria is that all of this was unfolding as the Jenner Kardashian circus was playing out in the evening news every week. And the natural tendency of people is like to pour all of that was going on in the media into the life of this one person. Well, you do that and you're going to destroy this young person because that's not their story, that's not their life, that's not what's going on. And but having the discipline, learning the discipline to be an observer of culture, what's going on, and yet at the same time deal personally with the people who are in our lives requires some very prayerful consideration. We're defining gender dysphoria in this way. These initial words are from Mark Yarhouse, who has written very helpfully on the subject. He's an evangelical and deeply committed both to his professional life as a clinician. He's doing peer-reviewed research in the area of sexual identity and has been for 20 years. But he's also chair of the psych department at Regent University in Virginia Beach and is working closely with churches, both predominantly in the areas of same-sex attraction and now with gender dysphoria. But he says gender dysphoria is the experience of distress associated with the incongruence wherein one's physiological and emotional gender identity does not match one's biological sex. Or to put that slightly differently, gender dysphoria exists when one's interior sexual identification, I am male, I am female, conflicts with one's biological sex. I have a male body, I have a female body. Or in the words of Robert Song, Christian ethicist, gender dysphoria is a body that is at war with itself. We looked briefly at ways that we respond to a person with gender dysphoria. And again, I'm doing this quickly by way of review, just for those of you that were not with us this morning. But I really would encourage you to begin with tears, to begin with a real sorrow for the brokenness of the world and things that are not the way they're supposed to be. You don't need to tell a person with gender dysphoria that things are not the way they're supposed to be. They live with a kind of anguish that drives them to attempt suicide at a rate that's 4 times higher than the general population. They know that something is not the way it's supposed to be. And so if we are going to care for folks who are in this kind of distress, we have to be close enough with them to be able to weep with them at the conflict that they experience and to commit to being with them for the long haul and to honoring them as someone who is made in the image of God. That is difficult to do because if you're honest, you look at the people that you know in your life, and you probably don't go around saying, "Oh man, you are so fearfully and wonderfully made." Like, "Oh, you just are crowned with the glory of God." Like Lewis says in the Great Divorce, or Weight of Glory. Thank you. If we really could see each other in the redeemed state that God has made us, we would be tempted to worship each other. Yeah, I confess, I don't live with that temptation very often. But why not? If indeed we are the bearers of God's image, we do need to refine the way that we look at each other and then in turn weep with each other. Also, we respond with humility. We do not understand everything that's going on in a person's life. We can hardly figure out what's going on in our own lives, let alone what's going on in the complex conflict of something like gender dysphoria. So we are committed to listening, and did I mention listening and learning? And there are things to learn. That's the third thing. We are committed to learning all that we can about what's going on. This is where we need to be humble enough to learn from the breadth of knowledge that's out there. We believe both in the wisdom of God's Word and in the goodness of common grace. We believe that there are people who are studying in this field, learning about the human mind, the human person. There are things to be learned that will help us. We acknowledge that in the area of everyday medicine. We should acknowledge that in every discipline of life. And with patience. There are no quick fixes in life. Some of you are old enough to be convinced of that. So we wait and work together. And we are patient also because not everyone will agree with us as we make this journey together. Even in this room, the ideas that I'm communicating to you, I'm certain that not all of you, in spite of my persuasive eloquence, you will not be persuaded by the perspective that I present you. I'm okay with that, and I hope we can learn to disagree if we understand that we are both committed to faithfulness to God, we are both attentive to God's Word. But we're patient too because the kind of distress that a person living with gender dysphoria faces is not something that is easily overcome. By way of analogy, you can think of someone who is struggling with alcoholism. You may know friends who would tell you, "Hi, I'm Steve, I'm an alcoholic. I haven't had a drink in 40 years, but I know who I am. It's part of who I live with, what I live with, and will live with for the rest of my life." But perhaps most importantly, we respond with hope. We are people who believe in the resurrection, and the resurrection informs every aspect of our lives, everything that we believe in, everything that is, when we look at what's broken, we say it's not supposed to be this way, but it's not the way it will be. And we know that because we believe in the resurrection, the first fruits of the world made new, the down payment that God has made in His own blood, that He will make things new and right. And that is true of all who struggle, and the great hope we want to offer them, and the great hope that we have as those caring for them too. The hope that we offer does not reside within ourselves. I have no power to fix or to heal. There is only one healer, and we trust our lives to Him. We're going to talk this afternoon. I haven't touched on this quite yet, but we're going to look at this afternoon. So this is a bit of a teaser for the segment to follow. But we're going to look at the ways that someone with gender dysphoria responds, these 5 different trajectories, if you will. Prayer for intervention, change of thinking, change of influence, change of expression, change of physiology. We'll look at those this afternoon. But for now, we're going to look at 5 different texts. I do this with some trepidation because I'm at a seminary, right? And there are folks who know more about this stuff than I do. But I will venture where angels dare to tread. Probably the most frequently cited text related to the question of gender dysphoria has to be Deuteronomy 22:5. A woman shall not wear a man's apparel, nor shall a man put on a woman's garment, for whoever does such things is an abomination to the Lord. I'm also linking it with the text in 1 Corinthians 11, because I think there is a strong correlation between the two. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as having her head shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have her hair cut off. But if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, then she should cover her head. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is degrading to him, but that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for long hair is given to her as a covering. Thanks. These two texts appear frequently in discussions about a biblical view of gendered presentation, how males present themselves as males and females as females. It's important to understand what these texts mean and teach, and how or if they apply to the decisions facing the person living with gender dysphoria. The scriptures speak about sexual behavior based on the assumption that because of the sexed nature of our image bearing, let me just pause right here. We began by looking at how we define, how we understand what it is to be male and female. And we are taking those two categories from the creation narrative in which God creates us as human beings, and in doing so creates us as male and female. So we're understanding maleness and femaleness to be essential to humanness, to be integral to that level of our being. That the gendered part of our lives is how we live that out. And the creation narrative, again, is helpful here because we see that we live our lives as, our gendered lives as male and female. This is male and female with distinction, yet in community, for image bearing, for culture making, and for marriage. So those are the three ways that we live out our gendered lives. And what we don't do, what we reject, is the idea that gender, that social experience of sex, then in turn comes back and redefines what it means to be sex, what it means to be male and female. Now, this is the way that gender is being reassociated with sex in our common culture, so that who I am is being defined by my social experience, by my lived experience. But we're saying, from a biblical perspective, our maleness and femaleness informs our gendered expressions, and not the other way around. So, the scriptures speak about sexual behavior based on the assumption that because of the sex nature of our image-bearing, we should be able to identify our own gender as well as the gender of others. That perspective establishes a significant correlation between a woman shall not wear a man's garment and in Deuteronomy 22:5, and does not nature itself teach you in 1 Corinthians 11. These two texts connect cultural expressions of clothing and hair with sexual identity. But the more particular question we need to ask, what is the relationship between these cultural expressions and essential sexual identity? In 1 Corinthians 11, what does Paul have in view when he talks about nature? Paul's use of nature cannot be a reference to ontological human nature or a universal state of being, or else, for instance, the Nazarite Vow, think of Samson, in which, as an act of God-pleasing worship, a man vows not to cut his hair. That would be inescapably sinful. Nature in this text must be something more localized or situated in the immediate cultural context. It must refer to cultural norms that give appropriate expression to both sexual identity and gendered relationships, so that we can honor marriage and do not sin against one another sexually. So the idea here is that we learn what it means to identify ourselves as male or female, and we then adopt cultural norms, cultural expressions, which give voice to that, so that when we look around the room, when we look at each other, we present ourselves to each other, something very essential is part of that communication. We're saying, I am male, I see, I perceive by what you're communicating to me that you are female or male. And then we proceed then to enter into relationship with each other based on that identification. And so therefore, we then have a responsibility both to present ourselves and then to relate to each other based on the clear communication of our sex. There should not be ambiguity about who we are. So in 1 Corinthians 11:24 functions similarly to Deuteronomy 22:5 in that both texts assume the biblical and creational expectation that we are to adopt cultural expressions that maintain male and female distinctions in our cultural settings and social relationships. The presentational character of sexual attraction has a lot to do with how we signal maleness and femaleness to one another. I mean, as a man, I'm attracted to the opposite sex based on what I perceive to be attractive, what I perceive to be the other. Marriage, ontologically, or that is universally, marriage depends on our ability to distinguish maleness and femaleness, and on the ability of one sex to recognize and desire the other. Both 1 Corinthians 11 and Deuteronomy 22 build on those assumptions. Now, the prohibition in Deuteronomy 22 refers to more than merely putting on clothes. The text does have in view the gendered wearing of clothes and the fundamental obligation to express and honor our physiological or embodied sex, and we should not overlook that implication. However, one of the most significant ways that we know that the text means more than simply the wearing of clothes is the declaration that this act of cross-dressing is an abomination to the Lord. I mean, the judgment of abomination is used in the Pentateuch almost exclusively for two sins: idolatry, which frequently had an illicit sexual component, and any sexual act which violates marriage. And so we reason, using the principle of lex talionis, or the rule of just measure, that the character of the judgment corresponds to the character of the action. And so I conclude with evangelical and Jewish commentators, therefore, that the prohibition related to cross-dressing most directly refers to the willful disordering of the biblical and physiological order. The Hebrew word here for garment has military overtones, and the text refers to the wearing of clothes much like a uniform that are culturally associated with the other gender as a way to act out sexually as a person of the other gender. So the prohibition against cross-dressing in Deuteronomy 22:5 has in view not play acting or espionage, neither of which is cross-dressing for prurient reasons, but a rejection of male-female distinctions in order to behave as the opposite sex for the purpose of sexual attraction and or engaging in illicit sexual behavior. Thus, in Deuteronomy 22:5, clothes are primarily a metonymy for sexually disordered behavior, homosexual sexual activity that violates the sexual and covenantal integrity of marriage, thereby warranting the abomination. So, in other words, to restate that a little more simply, is that the prohibition is fundamentally against dressing as the opposite sex in order to have sex with someone of the same sex. A very common practice both in pagan idolatry of the times and also a practice that is condemned here too. So the underlying prohibition is against homosexual sexual behavior, and the prohibition associated with clothing is primarily, as I understand the text, a means of doing that, an occasion for doing that. But it does not completely mask the importance of maintaining gender distinctions either. But that's a secondary issue in the text, I believe. As noted previously, the scope of Deuteronomy 22:5 does include the prohibition of cross-dressings for the purpose of individual sexual gratification, meaning a way of dressing for sexual arousal, in contrast to cross-dressing as a means of engaging in illicit relational sexual behavior. So we do make a distinction, I think a meaningful one, between things that you do for personal arousal, personal sexual gratification, versus things that you do that engage you relationally with someone else. And involving other parties in the behavior. Certainly there would be a prohibition against anything that is inappropriate sexual arousal and selfish gratification. Such cross-dressing violates the command to honor cultural expressions which maintain male-female distinctives, and it also violates the ninth commandment, which forbids us from bearing false witness, don't dress in order to deceive. That said, it's important to note that cross-dressing as a fetish is very different from dressing to bring relief to gender incongruence and has little to do with the experience of gender dysphoria that we're discussing. In most cases, when a person with gender dysphoria dresses toward or as the other physiological sex, he or she is attempting to resolve discontinuity by clarifying and is not an intent on confusing male and female distinctives or engaging in illicit sexual behavior. And while the context of 1 Corinthians 11 is the ordering of public congregational worship, the references to hair and head coverings assume our creational responsibility to find cultural forms that signal our maleness and femaleness to one another and that honor relationships built on the distinction of maleness and femaleness, most notably marriage. Paul implies that the clear communication both of maleness and femaleness and the relationship based on those distinctive expressions significantly informs the ordered congregational life and worship of God's people. So the principle affirmed by these two texts is that we are to live unambiguously as male and female. And most people who live with gender dysphoria want to live without ambiguity, without conflict. And therefore, I believe it is possible for us to regard with understanding and compassion those attempts at change by which a person with gender dysphoria attempts to live wholly of one sex. So, the underlying principle here in these two texts brings to the surface the need for us to honor creational distinctions of male and female, and that the cultural forms that we adopt, while those are not ordained, I mean, there's nothing, nothing in Scripture to define what male clothing or what female clothing looks like, and you simply have to do a survey of world cultures right now to realize that people have come up with a pretty wide range of ways of answering that question. I'm not Scottish, but if I were, I'm not sure I would wear a kilt, and if I did, I would certainly wear underwear. So I've got my limits on what I'm going to do. But that's just me. That's just my quirky, proclivities, interests, willingness, in what I'm willing to wear. If I lived in Saudi Arabia, I'd, spend a lot of time in a flowing gown. And my masculinity would not be insulted by that. So there are forms and expressions that we give to what it means to be male or female. Those are prudential decisions. I think it's quite significant that that Paul says in the middle of this passage in 1 Corinthians, judge for yourselves. That's a very important qualifier in the midst of this. He's expecting us to exercise judgment and discernment in these things so that we're able to say to each other, yes, we really are communicating our sex to each other well. This is where conversations of modesty come in, where we say to each other, either as male or females, the way you're dressing is, over-sexualizing you're over-sexualizing your presence and your presentation. Tone it down. So we have to be thoughtful, we have to be discerning about making the connection, both to preserve a clear communication of who we are as males and females, and then the way that those honor the relationships that are built upon those identifications and recognitions. So what does that have to do with someone who lives with gender dysphoria? It would be incorrect to say that someone who lives with the kind of conflict that is part of gender dysphoria, that they do not care about who they are. They don't care about these distinctions. But that's exactly incorrect. A person with gender dysphoria is saying, I don't want there to be ambiguity. I don't want there to be confusion. I want to be a whole person. I want to be wholly a male or a female. How do I get there? And so that should significantly reframe the conversation for us as we talk to folks who are thinking about finding relief and finding healing and hope. Two other texts, John 9 and Matthew 19. Jesus' disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. Matthew 19, Jesus said to his disciples, there are eunuchs who have been so from birth. There are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. How'd you get to be this way? You know, how'd you find yourself in this dilemma of living with gender dysphoria? You know, what'd you do wrong? You know, who did something wrong to you? Who caused this? You know, in the first of these texts in John 9, the disciples assume that there is some situational causality to this man's blindness. Who sinned? Clearly, this is God's judgment. This is God putting the hammer down on somebody. He's born blind. So who sinned? This man or his parents? Now, we touched on this morning, and I won't unpack it quite like I did this morning. But I think this begs us to think more carefully about how God is effectively causing things in the world. Most of us think of God's operation in the world as he's got this divine zapper, you know, just and he makes it happen. He decrees everything. That's the way God works, right? Let there be light. Boom. But that's not entirely how he works. He is at work through the way things unfold in the world. He's at work through what he has delegated to us as human beings, as image bearers. And in a broken and fallen world, things fall out because of that fallenness. They come to us because of that brokenness. They come to us. In fact, there's nothing that comes to us that is not bent or twisted. Even those of us who think we are normal and think we have nothing wrong with us, you know, we are more sinful than we would dare admit. We are more broken. We are more distorted than we would dare admit. We are not the standard of God's creational goodness. No one here is. No one has experienced that creational goodness. So whose fault is it that this man was born blind? Whose fault is it that this person was born with gender dysphoria? Did this person sin? Did this person's parents sin? Jesus says, you're asking the wrong question. You will probably never know unless God, in his infallible revelation, discloses to you what he didn't disclose to Job. You know, Job doesn't get an answer for why he experiences all the horror and the suffering and the disease and the death in his life. He does not get an answer. We know more than Job does. We look behind the curtain and we see this great, it's a little one-sided, but you know, it's a war in heaven. And we know where Job ends is where we need to end and where Jesus points us here. Job says in chapter 42, I know that nothing will thwart your purposes. I know that at the end of the day you hold me and you keep me, even though I don't have a clue what's going on. And so Jesus says, if you spend all of your days trying to figure out the mechanistic operations of the world, and did God do this, and did God punish them, and did God bless them, you're really going to take your eyes off the prize. And the prize is the glory of God. And to live with the confidence that even in the midst of great sorrow, in the midst of great brokenness, all of life, everything that we experience, is in God's hands so that He might display His glory. And that's a very different trajectory in coming to care for someone who lives with something like gender dysphoria. Jesus, a lot of ink has been spilled on this text in Matthew 19. I just want to say that while Jesus is not talking about sexual identity issues here, just the fact that he mentions the fact that there are people who are born eunuchs. I mean, people are debating what is people who are born without the ability to procreate. Okay, well that sounds like a pretty profound, sexual identity situation. If someone is born a eunuch, they are almost certainly growing up to be androgynous and living with all the physical implications of being a eunuch. I think just in what Jesus says, he's letting us know his awareness of the kinds of brokenness that exist in the world. And one of the kinds of brokenness is in this area of sexual identity. Our bodies don't work like they should work. And you often have a hard time knowing who we are. This morning I quoted from Augustine in The City of God, where he refers to a long history of cultures that have always had people in them that he refers to as hermaphrodites or androgynes. And he says, folks who have no way of knowing whether they are men or women. He writes with real compassion there. So I point you to this text just as an acknowledgement of Jesus' awareness of people who live with a real deep brokenness and sorrow in this area of gender identity. And then the third text that we'll look at is this 1 Corinthians 6, 9 and 10. Those who are sexually immoral, those who worship false gods, adulterers, both participants in same-sex intercourse will inherit the kingdom of God. Now, I'm using the Common English Bible translation because I really think they do a good job of getting it, getting at the sense of the text better than most of the others. What's that? Oh, yes. That would... thanks for that. I'll have to have a word with my my assistant. That would be me. I'm a one-man shop. Yes, thank you. But just make sure you're paying attention. Yeah, this word malakoi has been the object of a lot of conversation, and with respect to Robert Gagnon, who is probably given us the gold standard on the biblical exegesis related to homosexuality in the Scriptures. I think that the word malakoi, which is sometimes translated effeminate, and this is why this text becomes relevant to our conversation about gender dysphoria. Effeminate definitely communicates an expression, a style, a manner of behavior. But the word malakoi, which is sometimes translated effeminate, is used only 3 times in the New Testament, 2 of those instances being in non-sexual context. It refers to clothing. The word means soft and compliant. I believe that Paul does not use the word to refer to gender expression, that is, being limp-wristed, gentle, or sissy, or to sexual inclination. Rather, when used with homosexual, we understand Paul to be forbidding both passive, that is submissive, and active or assertive participation in same-sex sexual activity, as well as any sexual activity outside of marriage. This corresponds, in an ironic way, it corresponds to the Old Testament laws which interpret passivity as complicity in sexual sin. Like, oh, I'm not the initiator, it just happened to me. No, even in the case of the Old Testament, even distinguishes in the case of rape, any measure of resistance requires that we treat the incident as rape and not as compliance. And so what I think he has in mind here, and some of the translations you'll read of this particular text refer to translate this as male prostitutes. And I find that to be not credible, because Paul is writing to the church and he's listing sins that belong to the church. It seems a little odd that he would single out men for a particular sin in a list that applies really to the whole church. That seems a little incongruous to me. So I think the better sense here in this particular text is identifying both participants, sort of submissive and aggressive participants in same-sex intercourse and the condemnation of that. So just a couple of summary ideas. The body matters. We are not dismissive of the body and what it says about who we are. We have to answer the question that is often asked, did God make me this way? And we say, that's really not the question to ask, but I can believe that all of life is gift, as Alexander Schmemann says. How I receive what I am is quite different from demanding that God explain why I am the way I am. And therefore, our posture is more doxology than theology. We live our lives in praise, to the praise of the glory of His grace. We live our lives with thanksgiving for what has come to us, and not just living in the realm of knowledge that enables us to explain it. So, toward a theology of pastoral care, and with this we'll close. Given the reliability of the body to reveal a person's sex, exceptions are rare. We should rely on physiology as an indicator of sex unless we have significant reasons to believe otherwise. Secondly, given that God created sex as the basis for relationship with Himself and others, exceptions are to be recognized in community, not autonomously. Exceptions require corroborating support from those in a position to speak knowledgeably about a person's mind, body, spirit, affections, chemistry, etc. It's no small thing to conclude that a person's anatomy is communicating inaccurate information about that person's sex. And self-diagnosis, while important, is insufficient to justify an exception. I would just add here that it's so important that when you are caring for someone who lives with gender dysphoria, their self-awareness is so high. It's just pins and needles. Every little thing speaks to who they are. To very gently begin to draw them into a kind of community where they can hear more than just what's crying out from within. To win trust, to be able to speak into their lives and help them begin to place themselves in a bigger context, in a bigger picture, to better understand as much as possible what's going on. Given that sex is a complex and deeply mysterious gift from God, we must be humble about oversimplifying that complexity and speaking with improper confidence about matters we know only in part. God assures us that He will give us sufficient knowledge to live faithfully, but He offers no reason to believe that we can know anything comprehensively, and this assurance is true when we are making difficult decisions about understanding and charting a way through deep confusion and uncertainty related to sex. Given God's covenant, we should not be surprised by the regularity of life that results from His covenant faithfulness. But we must not confuse his faithfulness with the eradication of brokenness in this life. We experience change and healing by his redemptive and sustaining grace, and we give thanks for the predictability of life due to his providence. By his grace, it is common for us to rest in self-knowledge and to delight in the knowledge of others. Again, so much relies on the reliability of our perception, the reliability of our capacity to understand things and make sense of things. Jesus says, consider the lilies, consider the birds of the air. Even the fact that we've been given the Scriptures for the purpose of study and reflection is a testimony that our capacity to understand, to discern, to see clearly is a very reliable aspect of our lives. And so to somehow go against that in some way must be, that's ground we must enter into very, very carefully. But yet we know, how many times have you said, you've looked in the mirror and say, I feel fine, but you go to the doctor and your doctor says, well, I got some bad news for you. You're not aware of it, but you've got cancer. Oh. Doesn't look that way to me. There's always that appearance-reality tension that is going on in our lives. Given the nature of evil, we should not be surprised by the degree to which we can witness the destruction of God's good creation. Evil is present in the world and in us before we act and make our own contribution to this present evil age. There is no part of the universe untouched by the fall, evil, and sin. So we know that we will witness confusion and disorder in the most profound and disorienting ways in every area of life, including sex. Given the resurrection of Jesus and the promise of God, we may live together with our brokenness and sadness in hope, knowing that he is making all things new. One day he will wipe away all tears, and we will stand in his presence, known by name, male and female, whole, complete, without conflict, and full of glory. All right, I'll stop there and be glad to answer any questions that you might have.
As we say often, our students know this. This is a time for questions, not sermons. And so if you can compress it into 2 sentences, that probably means it's a good question. If it takes 5 minutes, it's probably a sermon. So there was a lot of rich stuff here worth teasing out with Steve, and we wanted to kind of open up, and some of you have dealt with this issue. Some of you have pastorally engaged it. Some of you just read about it. We're at many different stages in the conversation. So we've got one who's kind of thought about these issues in pastoral ways, and we want to just take advantage of the opportunity to kind of engage the conversation, if you will. And so let's open up. There's some microphones around. If you've got a question, raise your hand, and we'll see if we can get a microphone to you. Maybe it's right over here, and then one over there from this morning.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
In talking with a friend of mine who struggles with gender dysphoria, we just see it different. But so he'll say, I'm restoring my body to God's original intent. Mm-hmm. Just the same way you would with a child who has a cleft palate or somebody who has glasses. So the physical body is broken, and so we're restoring it. Mm-hmm. And so I say, well, you're restoring it to the author's original intent, which would be the original intent is to stay within your sex. Mm-hmm. So we're both kind of going at it the same way, mm-hmm. but we're each prioritizing a different, part of it, the body or the soul, he might say.
Right.
So at any rate, I find it difficult to get further than that.
Right. Well, that's a good place to be stuck. I mean, if your desire is really to be whole before the Lord, there could be worse places to be. I think one of the things that I found difficult in my experience, which is limited, is engaging in the larger community for conversation about this. Because a person has lived with this for so long, and in most cases people who have persistent dysphoria have lived this way most of their lives. They've lived with it for so long that it's really difficult to trust anyone else's perception of their experience. And I would work on that. I would say, how can we make this moment as well informed as possible, so that the way forward is as much in concert with a community of good voices, and not just my own self-perception. But I think at the end of the day, I mean, theologically, I can't exclude the possibility that the person's maybe the fix is to adjust the body to the ontology of this person. I mean, I can't exclude that. As you'll hear me say a little later, I don't recommend physiological changes, basically because I don't know that it's a cure to the problem, because we haven't really diagnosed the problem, so how do we know that it's a cure? And there's just not enough evidence that it really does resolve the problem in a way that we would, in a way that's similar to the way that other treatments resolve conflicts. So the jury's still out on that. But I think, I would, and I just, in the very biggest sense, I can't exclude the possibility that and again, this is my own sense of things. I'm not trying to speak on behalf of all of Christendom. But I do think that there's a place for allowing the possibility that the body's adjustment to the body is a move toward wholeness and coherence. Now, how you determine that? I mean, it's such a radical move. That's why I say I would never be a sole person making that determination. If indeed you conclude that that's the way to go, it needs to be very well informed, by wise, godly, people who are able to say, yeah, go that way.
Let me just tease that out just a little bit more in terms of the pastoral wisdom.
Yeah.
Part of what you were saying this morning is the challenge of a context, a cultural context, which says gender is always simply self-selecting, a matter of your own happiness, matter of your own, and so we want to push back in part against that. When do we accept our own testimony, and when do we let others speak into that? So either out of your own experiences or any guidelines, where is the balance between trusting your own instincts, as disordered even as they might be, or trusting the instincts of somebody else's observations about you?
Well, Oliver O'Donovan, in some of his commentary, by the way, his essay on transsexualism and marriage was written in the mid-'80s, so it's extraordinarily prescient. But he observes that persistent gender dysphoria has consistently proven to be intransigent to treatment. So I think that one way of sort of moving beyond sort of personal judgment in this is to have someone get to know you well enough to be able to discern with you what's going on, either to correct you and help you see things that you cannot see independently, which is often true for many of us, right? we often are not very good self-diagnosticians, and we benefit from helping each other see more clearly. At least I found that to be true for my children. The things that they don't, things that they don't see is just mind-boggling. So, yeah, to give validity to a person's experience and where they are is an ongoing part of our response. And as I mentioned before, this is true for a wide range of relational circumstances, racism being one that comes to mind very, very quickly. To listen to someone's story and say, I hear what you're saying, I believe you.
Let's bring some others in. There was a hand back over by Suzanne there.
I was just curious if you had any familiarity with Dr. Paul McHugh.
McHugh, yeah.
And because of his writings, I've kind of stepped back a bit when dealing with this in particular recently, just talking with a student and saying, I think you need to be patient in this, because I'd love to get your opinion on, one, what do you think of his viewpoints, and then also, I feel sometimes, and as I told the student, I said, I want you to be careful as you start throwing this terminology around, because I worry that because of the diversity that our culture fights so hard for, that you're being pigeonholed because of your confusion, because this point in time in your life, you're in a moment of confusion, you don't really know, you're starting to question, and you're just being, in an effort of diversity, you're being shoved, I feel like, into this kind of spot in life. So.
Yeah, I think that's very true, in that you see this in how the culture at large, I don't want to throw that around, what is the culture at large? But commonly you hear of children being very strongly directed to self-identify, being validated, affirm, yeah, you are who you think you are, and we will get behind you to help you be that. And that can be a rather destructive pressure. And we experience that in many ways, particularly youth who are impressionable. What is it that forms what they want to be and become? And this is just one more example of that, which has a lot of cultural currency and power right now. So I do think that it's important that particularly when we're working with youth, that we encourage them to be patient. Most cases, something like 70 or 80% of gender dysphoria cases resolve with puberty. When they persist past puberty, then we are entering into another dimension. So I think that's good advice, to say slow down, think about what's affirming you and what's pressuring you to say, yeah, this is what I should do. Again, this is where it's important that we encourage folks to value the community of the church, not just people shouting at them, to do what we think they ought to do, but really creating a place in which they can learn and grow and be safe. Again, hearing Rosaria Butterfield's comments. As for Paul McHugh, he's obviously had a huge history. If you don't know who he is, he's was on the medical staff at Johns Hopkins for many years, was involved very early on in doing sex reassignment surgeries. He has since recanted that and now says that he believes that's wrong. The difficulty that I have with McHugh is the way that he defines the whole issue of gender dysphoria. He limits it. I'm trying to find. I've got it. Here it is. McHugh limits gender dysphoria to 3 motivations, or more specifically, sex reassignment surgery has 3 motivations. Infants born with ambiguous genitalia. Okay, not much controversy there. Adults who find that cross-gender role-playing brings them sexual arousal, and adults who hope that reassigning their gender will help them integrate their homosexual orientation with their religious beliefs that forbid homosexual sexual conduct. Now, that's kind of a summary of how he sees people who are in this gender dysphoric category. He simply does not allow for the possibility that there is something essential that is disordered that needs to be addressed. It's either for him it's mostly a matter of sexual gratification that a person would pursue this, and I think that's an inadequate assessment of what people are experiencing, for the most part, because most people who, it's my understanding that most people who live with gender dysphoria have a diminished sexual attraction, and it's not what motivates them, which simply adds to their anxiety and their fear.
Let's take two more questions, because of the time. Go ahead, microphone back. Catherine, in the back there.
Thank you. So in my reading of gender and sexuality issues in the church, I've been sort of disturbed by this concept of gender essentialism, where Christians prioritize gender as being, there are two ways that you can be made in the image of God, and if you don't fit into those categories, gender becomes an oppressive normative in your life. How would you respond to whether or not we should see gender as being essential to how we're created in the image of God, and when you don't fit into those categories of what the church thinks gender should look like in your life?
Well, I think the distinction I would encourage a distinction between sex and gender. Sex being what we are ontologically, and gender how we give expression to what we are ontologically. And I think that if we follow what seems to be the case in the biblical text in Genesis 1, God has made us as male and female. This is a binary category. But how we live as male and female is quite diverse, both within a sort of a healthy range, in that maleness is not prescribed to look a certain way. Like, you will not find anyway, males like blue and drives trucks, and females like pink and play with dolls. I mean, a large part of that is socially, culturally imposed on what it means to be male or female. And then on top of that, you have all the fragmentation of brokenness that exists in our sexed lives. And so I think the way I would say it is that the diversity that we experience is not in the categories of male and female, but in the way those get worked out and lived out. Because I do think that for us to understand certainly what marriage is, we have to understand that it is based on a male and a female being able to procreate. Now, obviously not everybody's married, and we don't reduce maleness and femaleness to procreation. But one dimension of the gendered outliving of maleness and femaleness is marriage, and the capacity of this distinctively male, distinctively female identity being able to be one and to procreate. So the diversity, the fragmentation that we experience, I would suggest, is within these binary categories of male and female. And there are both a natural range of diversity that is, culturally fine, but then there's the fallenness that takes those categories and makes them into many, many different looking things. So,
a final question. Get a microphone over.
Hi, thank you very much. I just wanted to ask for clarification on something you mentioned. Forgive me if I misquote you, but...
Quite all right.
Thanks. I think you said something along the lines of, in the Old Testament, any sexual instance where there's any measure of resistance is categorized as rape. Or, yeah, I just wanted to ask which passage or passages you had in mind when you said that.
Well, what I simply meant was that the case law makes a distinction between complicity in a sexual act and non-complicity. Complicity is sin. and non-complicity is rape. So there's that distinction that the law makes, and that's the only point I was trying to make there. Does that help? Yeah. Yeah, I'm lousy on references. Leviticus. Help me out here. I'm in a seminary. Help me out here. Good. Yeah. 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 Thanks. Yeah. It's not in the one of the texts we go to for devotions every morning. So, but my apologies for not knowing it off the tip of my tongue.